Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I hope all of you are keeping well and staying safe. Myself, Ruwani Vimalasena, and I will be your host for today. A warm welcome to all of you and thank you for taking time from your busy schedules in order to be a part of a valuable discussion. In today's conversation, we are exploring the journey of a fintech in the startup ecosystem that is being encouraged and mentored with collaboration and support from corporates. The discussion will take you through a broader view of the startup ecosystem in Sri Lanka and about the recent fintech market trends. Then we will further discuss how collaboration plays a big role in fueling this ecosystem and supporting the future of fintech in the startup ecosystem by presenting you a few examples around the globe and how our own Freeme being the pioneers in the Sri Lankan fintech space. At the end of the discussion, we will move on to a Q&A session where we provide an opportunity for the fellow participants to pick the brain of today's speakers. If you have any questions for the speakers, share it with us via the Teams chat box so that I can take it up during the Q&A session. Before we move on to the serious business, let me share a few ground rules because all of us are logged into a virtual platform. No sooner you logged into the program, your microphone and your video are muted because then there won't be any disturbances while the speakers are presenting. Still, you can use the chat box and the reactions in order to communicate. So let me introduce the speakers for today. To start off with, we have Mr. Sachindra Samararatnam. Sachindra holds the position of Director of Startup Ecosystem at Information and Communication Technology Agency of Sri Lanka. He is passionate in leading teams to drive Sri Lanka towards a startup nation. He contributes by being a member of national level committees, creating a growth environment for innovation, entrepreneurship, and exports. Sachindra likes to engage with youth and startups through mentoring and judging national pitching competitions. Our next speaker, Mr. Randil Bateju, a long-standing member of the dynamic team of Nations Trust Bank. Randil was among the initial group of pioneers who championed the bank's efforts to become the single largest issuer of cards in Sri Lanka. In this endeavor, he also spearheaded the research, development and implementation of a wide variety of pioneering initiatives and First of Sri Lanka. He is currently in the role of a Senior Vice President, Sales and Digital Banking and responsible for growing the bank's digital footprint. He is also responsible for creating and executing strategic and tactical business development plans to augment the bank's sales efforts and digital banking, which cover corporate and consumer cards, consumer lending, retail banking, housing loans, foreign exchange services, digital banking, and Freeme. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a virtual round of applause for both Sachindra and Randil. Hi, Sachindra.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, over to you.
Right. Thank you for the lovely introduction, Rooney. Glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me to speak on something that I'm very passionate about and something that I've been driving for the past, I would say, specifically 5 years, but along my career of 12 years at ICTA. So to go into some of the specifics, let me share slide deck. Okay, hope you can see my slides.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Yes, we can see.
Great. Okay. Okay. So just putting on my timer. Right. So once again, thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about the startup ecosystem of Sri Lanka. And this is a journey which took place since 2010, especially when even the word startup was becoming mainstream in Sri Lanka. ICTA, which I represent, the ICTA Agency of Sri Lanka, had the privilege of starting the first incubator, which is Spiralation, which has been running for 11 years. And with that, so many different programs which were coined, which were initiated to support the startup ecosystem has been taking place, as you see on my slide. It has accelerated during the past 5 years with a lot of corporates, international bodies like Techstars, associations, chambers coming into the ecosystem to support it. And platforms being made, reports being published on the ecosystem. Sri Lanka became well known in the global front and made a name for ourselves. And I'm happy to say that since then, we have been working with global agencies like Startup Geno to represent Sri Lanka in the global space and to become relevant. This was further accelerated this year in 2021 when with the restructuring of ICTA, where the digital economy pillar was given preference, with the startup ecosystem development being highlighted or being recognized as a specific SBU, which I represent today, and which provides or which gave the indication to the country of the focus that Sri Lanka was giving, especially as a government body, for the startup ecosystem development in the country by having a specific team to do that. With all this, we're working with many entities in our ecosystem to collaborate towards a startup nation with the vision of achieving this by 2024. The startup nation that we envision is inclusive, it has a positive impact and sustainable, which means its dividends of the startup nation will trickle down to all parts of the country, to all people. We want to foresee a startup and investor-friendly government, laws and policies. To do that, we have to build on an entrepreneurial education system. With all these things in place, we envision a globally recognized set of startups and founders with an ecosystem which is locally and globally connected. So this is the paradigm that we foresee. This is what we want to bring forth as a startup nation. Where are we now? According to Startup Geno and the Global Startup Ecosystem Report back in 2020, we came to a tune of the ecosystem value to $417 million. The ecosystem value is a new indicator. It's different to GDP, different to per capita income. This is the way that startup ecosystems are measured. So we became relevant and we had a number back in 2020. This was a 4x growth from the earlier report, which is in 2017, which is $32 million, $217 million. Also, note the subsectors that we were featured in this report, which is FinTech. 2021, we see a growth of 13% during a time when the pandemic also had hit. We've seen that the ecosystem had grown by 13% to 132 million, with new subsectors being recognized, with clean tech and ag tech, which are the hot topics of the world and where Sri Lanka has become more and more relevant in the startup ecosystem space that we're in. Nationally, we have our own platform, which started back in October 2019 with 32 startups being registered initially and now grown to 601 technology startups being registered on this platform. Because of the platform being enabled for the country, we also have a data-driven approach in growing this ecosystem. We understand how the startups are regionally distributed, as you see on this slide. Yes, predominantly the startups, the density in our country is Western province, but you see that all the other provinces, especially if you see North, that's the second largest startup ecosystem, regional ecosystem in the country. And other ecosystems growing, the Central province, Uva province, all growing in its number of startups that are coming through the province. I'm happy to say that startup hubs have been launched in all these provinces. And by December, we will see all these hubs coming together. We'll also see some statistics on this chart that I show how the registrations on Startup SL also has grown, and which means that even during a time of pandemic, we are seeing technology startups being formed, technologies, ideas coming into the space and then growing. Also, the type of startups that we see here, as you see in your offering, are not only services startups, not only startups who do mobile applications and software and e-commerce, it's startups who are in the artificial intelligence space, Internet of Things, and with a special mention on FinTech, you'll see that there are 54 startups registered on this platform. And altogether, the Startup SL registered companies generate about 5,620 opportunities as employment. This is a bit of an old compilation of our industry verticals, but just want to show how diversified we are in terms of the different types of industry verticals that our startups serve. And to give another view of a more recent one, the earlier one was 2019. So this was what I'm showing to you was done by, Nuan with his data visualization of Startup SL. You would see many other verticals being represented, and with FinTech also being represented as a large cohort with the companies that are listed here. The startup ecosystem in our country is highly networked. This is a network diagram showing the various entities who are part of this ecosystem. Something we need to understand is it's not a siloed approach when you develop. It's an ecosystem thinking that we have to think of. Even when it comes to FinTech, FinTech on its own also has its own ecosystem. And it's a subsector of the national ecosystem, but it also has its own ecosystem with the various different kind of players you see. Universities, incubators, accelerators, chambers, associations, co-working spaces, ministries, angel investors, all of them coming together to form an entrepreneurship ecosystem. And here are some of the examples that I've extracted a few from those players in Sri Lanka who are operating these different types of what we call startup service and support organizations. Sri Lanka, throughout the past 5 years, have been connecting globally with various entities. Some of our recent partnerships have been with the European Union through the European Union Sri Lanka Innovation Partnership, with Germany having a partnership with Impact, which is representative of the Berlin Senate. Already supported 3 startups with their virtual launch to Germany in October, connected to the Startup Genome Network, and all of this supports Sri Lanka to be placed on the global map, while also getting support for incubation, for acceleration, and market access. And this is a very important aspect when it comes to an ecosystem that we don't only look at our own country, but look at the region and going beyond that, looking at the world where we connect with all different types of startup ecosystems and understanding what the challenges that they face are the similar challenges that we can learn from them on how they overcome it. How do we understand markets? How do we partner with these ecosystems so that we have mutual benefits across markets? And these are aspects of ecosystem thinking that is very important when growing an industry. Another important aspect of 2020-2021 was the startup friendly government report, which was published by ICTA and PwC, understanding 12 broader areas of challenges or impediments faced by startups. And you will see number 11, one of the main challenges is access to debt funding. Likewise, we had 12 bigger buckets which were identified and 29 separate impediments, which ICTA and with the support of ecosystem players are working with 14 government authorities who are responsible and who will work with us in tangent to work through these various impediments. And this is a policy related focus. It's regulatory impediments, policy related impediments, processors, information sharing. If I put this in a nutshell, all this is being looked at and being revamped so that the startups will have better support and a conducive environment. We would like to say that right now, the approach that we are taking for startup ecosystem development is a data-driven approach. We have worked with global agencies like Startup Genome to benchmark Sri Lanka according to their success factor matrices, which puts us in the activation phase. This is the most primary phase, which is where Sri Lanka is in right now. We have less than 1,000 startups, but it also shows the potential of growth. And growing this ecosystem, Startup Genome have highlighted 3 main focus areas, which is to grow number of startups, increase startup quality, and increase early stage funding. And this is for what we invite all parties, government and private sector to collaborate with us to ensure that we grow to a number of 1,000 startups and increase our startup quality where we achieve our revenue numbers. You would see where we stand in our startup output and the startup density. But looking at this in a different way, this also shows the potential that we can reach. With the university system that we have, Startup Genome has pointed out that we can grow 15x. And growing this 15x is predominantly through homegrown startups. Someone would think that we might have better opportunities in attracting foreign startups. That's not the actual case. But they have showed us here, even Silicon Valley, the highest number of startups are homegrown. And a certain percentage is from direct attraction. So 70% are domestic startups. And that's where we should start. And that's why we plan to collaborate with many entities. A very important aspect of this ecosystem is its diversity, its representation, and being able to have the best talent leading this ecosystem. And therefore, we've realized that the female founder percentage is very low, less than global average, and are working towards that with our ecosystem stakeholders to increase this female founder number. We've realized that the local connectedness is low, and therefore working with startup hubs around the region. And I'm happy to say that today we launched our own startup space called Sparks Lab at ICTA to be able to support early stage startups with this local connectedness which is required. Startup quality is a very important area. And the second facet of what I showed, what Startup Genome has pointed out. And one of those areas of startup quality is to understand what is the subsector that we should focus on. I would remind you that I mentioned FinTech as a subsector that Startup Genome identified back in 2020. So when we think about a subsector, they take an example of Frankfurt, which is known to be a hub for FinTech. And why? This is the reason that you see on the screen. The strength that they have through legacy industries, which is the number of banks which are situated, and about 53 of them are global and 18 which are top 25 global banks. They are also very focused on this startup cluster as FinTech as a startup cluster, which 30% of those startups are in FinTech, and many different programs being run in this ecosystem. Frankfurt is a large city, but they have focused on this particular niche area, and they have ensured that they have the required input to build FinTech startups, and therefore they are successful in having a good output of high revenue growth FinTech startups by creating a conducive environment. Startup Genome looks at a particular subsector. If you take FinTech, based on these criteria, it has to have the right type of talent. It needs to have right type of funding, the experience of people who are mature in its domain. And all of this together will ensure that a subsector is formed and a subsector can grow. With that, what ICTA and its other stakeholders are looking towards is working on this funnel in collaboration with various corporate entities. If I'm to explain this a bit, I would say this is the startup strategy on what we have adopted as a country, where national bodies and other entities would look at increasing the startup funnel from its right-hand side, broadening the funnel, running programs to ensure that we have budding entrepreneurs being supported so that they can start their businesses. This is the very early stage. We call that the ideation stage. And we need to handhold these startups at this point to take them through in building their startup, attracting like-minded co-founders, attracting team members so that they can establish it and start gaining their first set of customers, ensuring their product market fit, and start earning revenue. But after that, they still need to be further supported so that they can grow to their next set of customers at a certain point that they can look at outside of Sri Lanka and grow in their revenue margins. And that's where we need to support them through acceleration and various market access programs. Sri Lanka as a target has a target of 1,000 startups by 2024, which is set by the government mandate as well, which industry and national bodies are working towards. Within these 1,000 startups, we would like to see at least 700 of them earning revenue. And from that 700, at least 200 to be what we call scale-ups. In Sri Lankan terms, looking at our context, we could say that a scale-up would earn more than $250,000 or $100,000 of annual recurrent revenue and beyond. So within this 200, our intention is to support a group of 20 high growth startups so that we could see at least 5 to 6 exits by 2024 or more. So recent exit that we saw was in Singa, which was for the value of $15.5 million. So you can realize having such exits will highly impact the revenue growth of our country, which in total is a target of $3 billion by 2024 from this technology sector. So with this, I would complete my very brief presentation on an overall landscape of the startup ecosystem. Just to highlight on some of those points, when growing a startup ecosystem, it is important that we have ecosystem thinking and that we grow with the various enablers of the ecosystem. And within an ecosystem, when we are mature enough, we look at a particular subsector. And hence, like Frankfurt has looked at FinTech, Sri Lanka will also look at the variables of input and output and the support that can be provided to a subsector, just as Startup Genome has looked at in its matrix, to understand which subsector to support. So in the next presentation, we could understand what's our FinTech ecosystem like, how does it tally, how does it coincide with what Startup Genome talks about, and then further go into questions to understand how the broader startup ecosystem works in hand with the FinTech ecosystem in collaboration to grow towards a startup nation. Thank you, and handing over back to the moderator.
Thank you very much, Sachindra. And with that, I would like to invite Randil to continue the conversation now. Randil, over to you.
Right. Thank you, Sachindra, for. Am I audible, Rooney?
Yes, Randil, you're audible and you're visible too.
Right, thank you. And thank you, Sachi, for the detailed explanation on the startup ecosystem in Sri Lanka. And as Sachindra explained, I think what we've tried to do here is to see how a fintech collaboratively, journeys with the startup ecosystem, and how do we, take it forward in Sri Lanka is something that, Freeme as a brand trying to do, and we want to encourage that effort and the theme on those lines. And we thought, we will discuss some of the stuff that how a fintech will take the journey in the startup ecosystem. Quickly just to talk about the global landscape on the fintech. I think there's billions of dollars invested in the fintech landscape. So for obvious reasons, I think fintech compared to some of the other startups, I think some people would want to set up a fintech itself. Sometimes it costs a lot. However, I think there's over $50 billion invested. I think 500 plus new fintechs, successful ones created across the world. And one main action that the fintech will provide is the unbanked people to come into the platforms or into the banking streams, which is a key feature. And with the government sponsorships in different countries, take Bangladesh or wherever, that is one key aspect which the government will focus. And also the online penetration, the digital transaction modes coming up, that's a huge booster for all the fintech platforms across the world. And as Sachi said, there are a lot of IoT technologies coming into the market, a lot of connected ecosystems coming in. Fintechs have been able to leverage that and try and give the whole platform, fintech platforms, to all those IoT providers as well as different tech and service-based startups as well. If I just take the fintech overall landscape, I think there are different types of fintechs when we look at the fintech space. And I think the largest or the most favorite fintech is the paytech part. So I think if you take all the investments, about 92% of net worth is generated on the paytech across the world. So I think, but obviously that is because the payment infrastructure was the need of the moment when the economy started getting digitalized. But now you see other types of fintechs like wealth management to capital markets. Then one very important, which is coming up very fast now, is the insure tech. Then the lending part, P2P, as well as different types of lending, and also on the crowdfunding as well. So I think there are different views on it, but I would want to call that also those platforms also like a fintech platform. And obviously on the property side, I think a lot of countries are moving to that purely because of different regulation processes, but mainly to ensure that the whole transaction methodology is streamlined. So I think these are the main 8 platforms or the fintech types, I think defined, and this is something that is seen in the world as at now. Just to take a quick view on the different types of fintechs, I think this is recognized by the evaluated by BCG. I think a report released this year. So different types of fintechs as well as banks in the whole ecosystem has been evaluated just to understand what sort of space and the growing space in that whole area. So if you take, India, Paytm, driving that whole effort in that market, and obviously with a lot of overseas investments. But if you take China, the largest in terms of the fintech part, so obviously if you take WeChat, the whole fintech, but obviously leveraging the whole ecosystem, which is the instant messaging and the social media platform they own, and 1.2 billion, users in that whole platform, is something that is changing the whole fintech space. Obviously, Freeme also was listed from Sri Lanka. Obviously, based on the work that we've done within that whole fintech space. And I think one key area that we've identified is that all these fintechs have built different ecosystems, which will facilitate the other startups within that country, which has actually taken those startups also along with those fintechs journey. So I think that is something that we, we want to take part, and we want to encourage other fintech partners as well, through different types of initiatives, to take all the institutions that Sachi spoke about and showed all of us, with the whole journey that the fintech is growing. So I think if you take just basic two examples, I think how Paytm has enabled the whole startup ecosystems in India. They've migrated onto what you call a super app. But I think one key space that they've allocated is to enable the startup ecosystem in India. So moment you want to enable on Paytm, I think they are a separate there's a separate team who would look at it and enable all the payments on the startup's website, as well as they will bring them in app so that they will have that access to all the customers. Also, it's a zero setup cost for all the startups. Then obviously there are benefits on establishing that model. I think Sachi spoke about how ICTA and other startup ecosystems in Sri Lanka is planning to grow the current startups to a different level through different types of mechanisms, and they're targeting at least about 10% of those to seriously grow. So I think that is something that fintechs will have to support, so that the whole startup ecosystem will come onto the same platform and grow with that. And obviously in Singapore, the Aspire platform, I think that has now grown into a lot of small and SME type of startups also being enabled. So I think that is something that that is happening across the world, and we want that to happen in Sri Lanka as well. So I think we've just tried to put something, to see how the definition of the collaborative journey is. That I think fintech, the main thing on the fintech is, if you want to, when we start up a fintech, there are a lot of, obviously the end user and the consumer plugged onto the fintech platform. Then there's a lot of tech development which will happen on the payment processing, as well as customer engagement, the journeys and things like that. And obviously, to make that fintech very successful, there are corporate institutes and payment processors and payment network providers like Visa, Amex, Master, all those guys plugged into that. And obviously, there's a lot of government and regulation which will also be governing those fintechs. So there's a link into that. And obviously, the backing of certain financial institutions of processing those payments, connecting them to networks, and all the stuff is happening on a fintech point of view. Then what happens is, obviously the other startups which happens in the same area, how the fintech would enable and take a collaborative journey with the whole other ecosystem, based on the exposure and the links that they have. I think one area that they will also, always have expertise in the customer journey and the insights and the data. So I think there are a lot of payment processing and a lot of data on a financial side and customer behavior, which can be leveraged and, passed on to the whole ecosystem of the other startups. And obviously business and commercialization model. So based on the the interactions that they have, the fintechs have with banks and other regulatory bodies, there's a good understanding that which they can provide to the different types of startups, to collaborate and make. Sachi was talking about making revenue. I think so. So that is something seriously working with those startups to ensure that they grow. And obviously financial aid, based on different types of relationships and different types of models. Financial aid is something that will take that, will be an important part. And I think last but not least, exposure into the payment infrastructure, basically to complete the end journey, and also expose the whole startup ecosystem to the end consumer by providing the last leg of payment. So I think payment or financing. So I think that is the whole a whole journey that we look at least to try and facilitate some of the startups within the country. And we wish and we want to work very closely with ICTA in the future to try and see how we can enable, with the support with some of the other other fintechs as well, which we are in constant discussion with. And that is something that we want to work with in Sri Lanka. So obviously in Freeme, I think some of the main areas that the startups will be very interested in is like there's about 14 billion funds which has gone through this year, coming into Freeme, and payments to transfers to different stuff. So I think that is something the whole ecosystem can leverage when we bring in some of the startups into the same into our ecosystem. And obviously there's QR transactions enabled. That basically all the payment infrastructure will also be provided. So I think that is something that that we want to share with the whole startup ecosystem and help them to try and model their business around it. So I think we just won. I think yesterday we won an award as well, I think, for showcasing some of the help and some of the collaborative efforts that we have taken with some of the startups into Freeme, and trying to take them through with enabling them. I think in the whole in the journey towards success. I think that is something that we work very very closely and very passionately, and we want to do that in the future as well. So I think in the interest of time, that's all I wanted to share. But however, if there are any points to discuss, I'll be happy to answer on how we can collaborate.
Thank you very much, Ramil. So without further ado, I would like to move on to the Q&A session. So to begin the conversation, I would like to ask this question from Sachindra. Hi, Sachindra.
Hi, yes, I'm.
So in your opinions, what are the plans in the national strategy to ensure the dividends of the digital economy? What are the plans in the national strategy to ensure the dividends of the digital economy to distribute in all other regions and sectors? What are your views on that?
So the startup strategy, which has been rolled out in Sri Lanka, has in its initial stage identified that the higher density of startups is in Western province, and therefore it is critical that we are able to ensure that we provide a conducive environment for those in other provinces with the required facilities so that they can also start businesses, so also start tech businesses. And as I showed on my first slide, the northern province already had its own startup ecosystem being formed especially because of YAL IT playing a major role. But after that, it's only in 2016 that we saw that the Uva province were able to, again led by a few individuals, started off their own startup hub, which is the Uva startup hub. So since then, with the current strategy of regional cluster development, which is a decentralized approach for the digital economy dividends to trickle down to all people, in the past few months, we were able to work with the other provinces, especially Sabaragamuwa, Central, and Eastern provinces for them to start their own startup hubs. And they're formed right now. Within the next 2 weeks, we will see the Northwestern, which is the Wayamba province, the Southern province, and the North Central province also gathering together and starting their own startup hub. So we've realized that it's by empowering these startup hubs, empowering people, empowering them to connect with their own ecosystems, and ICTA being a facilitator, providing the support that they require either in terms of grant funding or capacity building for them to build their own startup ecosystem. That's the only way that we can grow in our numbers. And if you saw in my slide, we are seeing that taking place with more and more being connected. So in the future, what ICTA envisions is that these startup hubs will act as our liaison officers or our franchisees in these areas of startup ecosystem development. And they will drive policy, they will input for national policy development, but also speak on behalf of the interest of that particular province. And this is how we see this decentralized approach taking place, where the dividends of the digital economy, especially in terms of the ability to start tech businesses, being an opportunity for every person in the country, irrelevant of which province that they come from.
Thank you very much. So for the fellow participants, so if you have any questions, concerns that you would like to get clarified, you can use the chat option and send it across to us. So meantime, I would like both the speakers to collaborate and provide an answer for this. How corporates can become enablers in the startup ecosystem?
So if I may start, I think Sachi was talking about in the morning as well. I think when his new startup co-working space was launched, how the corporates, how they expect the corporates to work to support the ecosystem. So I think the corporates and the banks and all the large institutions in the country own a lot of share in terms of the space that the consumers have. So I think corporates play a massive role in taking these startups to market, so that as a country that we will achieve those parameters and the targets and the goals that we have to go global, to support them. So I think that making the startup, having the proper environment, the funding, as well as the business knowledge is something the corporates can take on and actually support these guys. So I think that is something that the corporates have to take accountability and responsibility, and we will have to make a larger role, play a larger role to support bodies like ICTA, as well as different types of ecosystem builders, to do that. So I think that is my take on that.
So I would say, linking to what Ranjil was saying, for a startup ecosystem to grow, it's a tripartite partnership between corporates, government, and the academic sector as universities. And that's how even those ecosystems that we praise so far, like Silicon Valley, also grew because of this relationship. So we've seen that corporates have come into this space throughout the few years, like conglomerates like John Keel's, Hemas, Demo, LLC, starting off some of their own incubation or accelerator programs, especially when it comes to JKX, which is also part of your holding company. But banks, especially in other countries, we've seen running their own incubation programs, especially for fintechs, which onboard and piggyback on the network that you have. So what we hope is that especially strong corporate partners like ATB working with the Freeme platform can provide this space, hand-holding them at the early stage and then helping them to scale when they grow in their revenue. And I'm happy to say that spiralation startups which have come through our incubator, like Tiaga, like Helios, MintPay, which we have also supported, are also been supported by Freeme. And that's good collaboration, but there's much more that we can do. While we support startups in that space, another area is the core business of banks, which is to provide the funding, which is required as assured. And as you know, we've embarked on an alternative credit evaluation framework, which we're working with currently 15 banks that we have engaged with. But I'm happy to say that NTB is one of the banks that we have progressed, which from the 3 banks that we have progressed, and just waiting on the 12 others to ensure that we provide the capital required for these technology startups, actually technology scale-ups, to go to the next level. So different facets on how corporates can support, but what is evident is that the corporates have to support. Otherwise, we won't have a flourishing startup ecosystem.
Thank you very much. So we have a question from one of the participants. So Kalana would like to know any support or platform ICTA to startups to if they're going global.
Great, thanks Kalana for the question. So since 2020, ICTA has partnered with the European Union Sri Lanka Innovation Partnership. And if you go to the Startup SL platform right now, you would see a set of information and I would say a portal where if you're interested in approaching the European market or penetrating the European market, you can register to those programs, and there is a selection process where they would help a selected set of startups which have a product market fit to explore the European market. So right now we have about 15 such startups who have been selected for a handheld process, a very closely handled process where they develop a strategy for you to approach the market. Because going global is not something you can do overnight. You need to have your house in order. You need to have even if your product market fit is stable for Sri Lanka, it doesn't mean that it's stable for another region. They have their own mechanisms. If it's regulated environments, especially like FinTech, it has to be contextualized. So the European Union partnership, it's called the help desk, which you can even access today by going into startupsl.lk. I'll type that web URL on this platform. Apart from that, we have various programs with embassies, and a similar one which was launched about a month back. It was launched to Germany, which 3 startups are now going through a soft landing program. One good thing is, because of another different side of the pandemic, is the soft landing programs which are physical is now all online, and it's opened up to a lot of more players, giving more opportunities than before. So it's a good time for you to get on board a program like that.
Thank you, Sachindra. To rest of the participants, if you still have any questions, I appreciate if you can send it across through the chat box. So use the chat box and send in your answers, send in your questions. So Sachindra, in your view, what are the ingredients needed for a subsector such as a fintech to excel and grow? What is your opinion on that?
Just remembered something to add to my earlier answer. Right now, we have been able to provide 72 opportunities for 42 startups in terms of helping them for market access. I want to especially mention that because it's, I thought my earlier answer would have given very small numbers, that it's only for a few, because we talk about 600 startups, so is it only 10? But it's not the case. So much of opportunities have been provided, and 42 individual startups have got the opportunity. Sorry, wanted to add that. Coming back to your question, In terms of the ingredients which are required, I would refer back to the slide which I showed. I'll just put it on again. With Startup Genome, especially, yes, this particular slide of how do you grow a subsector. And in our discussions with Startup Genome in our initial stage on how they identified a subsector, we went deep into this to understand what are the subsectors that Sri Lanka can grow. So if you take FinTech, the reason that FinTech was selected in 2020 as a subsector was because FinTech was one of the areas that a specific vertical focus accelerator was running, which was the HatchX program, which was run by the support of the Ford Foundation, Lankan Angel Network, and Hatch together. So which meant there was a certain input, which is the incubation program, and there was a funnel of startups, which there was a selection process, and they got into a program. And through this program, they've got the capacity building that they required. They got connected to investors, which means there's traction, investor traction, which is seen for that subsector, and good quality startups came out. But that's an area that we really need to see fintechs going global. If you look at the report published by Startup Genome, especially on the fintech ecosystem of the world, you'll see the countries which are ranked high. And why they are ranked high? Because they've built a conducive environment for certain subsectors in that country. So for Sri Lanka, another subsector which might work would be agri-tech, the agriculture sector, because for the agricultural economy, we have a higher percentage of farming land, and therefore we could have a test bed for agri-tech solutions in the country. So these factors are quite important in growing a subsector, and which is something that Freeme can also look at in identifying whether Freeme as an ecosystem enabler can drive some of these factors to create the fintech ecosystem in the country. So we can share these details as well. I will end with that.
Thank you, Sachindra. So considering the time factor, we might have to go for just one last question, and I would like to ask from Randir. So how can fintechs such as Freeme add value to startups in the ecosystem?
So I think not only Freeme, I think there are there are so many other startups which has or fintechs which has come off for Sri Lanka. But I think the main thing is that there are different stages of their life cycle. So I think overall, as the fintechs, as I tried to explain before, is also mainly to focus on bridging the gap of the last leg of the entire market. That is the largest space that the fintechs play in. The final leg in terms of payments, settlements, to investment and things like that. So I think that is something that the startups or the fintechs will have to play a key role in Sri Lanka. In collaboration with everybody else, all the other types of startups. I think some of the names that Sachi mentioned on or basically showed on the previous one, though it is not related to Freeme per se. As at a bank level, we've enabled most of those startups. The final leg in terms of through different types of APIs to payments or settlements, to enabling their business models, to make their processes efficient. So I think those are the main things that the fintech providers can actually help the whole market or the other startups which are coming to seriously be ready to go global. Otherwise, to go through the whole journey of understanding what to do, what not to do, is something that that the fintechs can bring onto the table, and enable. So I think that is my view on that.
Thank you very much. So with that, we have to conclude the Q&A session as well, and we have come to the end of the program. I will not be doing justice if I do not thank the individuals who are behind this overall program. First of all, I would like to thank all the participants for being a wonderful audience, and I believe this knowledge sharing session will definitely come in handy for you in the future. And a big thank you to both the speakers, Sachindra and Randil, for sharing valuable insights and providing a broader view of the startup ecosystem in Sri Lanka and about the recent fintech market trends. And a big thank you to our Freeme team for organizing the overall event. Not forgetting Information and Communication Technology Agency of Sri Lanka for all the support given throughout the program. Ladies and gentlemen, life is easier than you think, and Freeme is all about making your life easy. Yet to download the app? It's quite easy. Scan the QR code which appears on the screen and live effortlessly with Freeme. Thank you once again for joining with us and enjoy the rest of the evening. Good night.